Okay, so we want to welcome, let me just take a moment to welcome everyone here today. For our students in our class, Leading the Holy Cross Way, welcome to your 7th and final session of the season. I want to thank you all and congratulate you for just making the decision to take this one credit class. And I know and I believe that you've gained a lot from it. And I'm really grateful. It can be difficult on a football Friday afternoon especially to carve out the 90 minutes that you do here, but I think and know confident that you've grown as people, you've grown as leaders, you've grown as Holy Cross leaders specifically, and you've benefited from this these weeks. So we want to welcome our community guests as well. We have some parents, I believe, in the audience. We have members of our faculty and staff. We have some of our friends here from Holy Cross Village and other members of our South Bend community. We have Holy Cross Brothers in attendance, and so we're really delighted to have you all with us because we're in for a really special treat. So just a really quick recap for the benefit of those who are visiting. Leading the Holy Cross Way is based on some research that I did during my time at St. Edward's University. In preparation for the creation of a set of training modules that were being used across the country and around the world by Holy Cross educators in the K through 12 sector. This particular class is based on a module in which we studied, my team and I studied, I think it was 10 or 12 historical Holy Cross leaders. So ranging from the founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross, Blessed Basil Moreau, those famous figures that we know here in history, Father Edward Soren, of course, Father Ted Hesburgh, Sister Madaliva Wolf, who was at St. Mary's, of course, for many years, a long-standing president at St. Mary's College. Mother Mary the Seven Dolours, the foundress of the Marianite Sisters of Holy Cross. And then some of the other leaders, Brother Vincent Pio and Saint Brother Andre Bessette. So there were about 10 or 12 Holy Cross historical leaders that my team and I studied. And our premise was really to see if we could identify specifically a set of characteristics or a theory, a leadership theory, that was distinctly Holy Cross. And what we found that there were 7 attributes in common among these leaders. Number one is that they led and they made God known, loved, and served with a spirit of zeal. So the first characteristic was zeal. And the students know this, they've heard this, we repeat this each week. And you know, as Christian leaders themselves, as Holy Cross leaders, we also know that their charge, their call, is they recognize that possessed within each one of them is the ability to bring hope and healing to the world. That's what they're endowed with, is to bring hope and healing to the world. And as Christian leaders, that all of their doings, all of their work is always pointing towards God, right? So in the characteristics, number one that we identified was zeal. Number two is piety. And when we speak about piety, piety is a commitment to a cause, right? We often think of it in religious terms, of religious piety, but we define piety specifically that there's a commitment to a particular cause. Number three is that these leaders all possessed a humble servant leadership style, so humble servanthood. Number four was that these leaders possessed the competence to see the needs of the world and particularly the injustices of the world. And then number five, they possessed the courage to act on those principles. And then the sixth characteristic is a characteristic that's based on the virtue of magnanimity. Magnanimity. And the virtue of magnanimity is the pursuit of greatness, but not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the common good and the greater good. Right? Ultimately, greatness is defined through the eyes of Christ. And in that pursuit, it takes a bit of an entrepreneurship mindset. So just the last session, 2 weeks ago, the group of panelists that we had were all local entrepreneurs who talked with the students about possessing that entrepreneurship mindset. So we put those together. Entrepreneurial magnanimity was characteristic number 6. And then the final characteristic is really, I think, distinctly Holy Cross, is the principle of accompaniment. That these were not leaders who led from some pulpit. These were not leaders who were disconnected or disassociated from the people that they worked with, but rather, as we do in the congregation of Holy Cross, they walked side by side with all people. And we see that countless occasions in the leadership style of Holy Cross leaders. Ultimately, it's what we talk about here at Holy Cross College. They were disciples with hope to bring. They were disciples who lived passionately and hopefully. They prepared the world for better times. And that's exactly what this class has been all about. Today, we're especially fortunate to have with us a guest speaker, and they've now had 6 guest speakers that they've heard. So their 7th guest speaker of this season is Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin, who is the John J. Cavanaugh Associate Professor of the Humanities at the University of Notre Dame, jointly appointed in the program of Liberal Studies and the Department of Theology. She also serves as the director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, which we know many of you are Soren Fellows. The Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture is the University of Notre Dame's leading institute for scholarly reflection within the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition. A systematic theologian, Dr. Martin's research explores 19th and 20th century Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thought, Trinitarian theology, theological aesthetics, religion and literature, ressourcement theology, and the nature of religious tradition. Her first book, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and the critical appropriation of Russian religious thought, which was published at the University of Notre Dame Press, was named one of the 10 international winners of the 2017 Manfred, I don't know how I'm going to say that last name, Laugenschlager Award for Theological Promise. Dr. Martin has published more than 25 articles and book chapters in journals. She serves on the editorial boards of Communio, Religion and Literature, the New Ressourcement, the Elements of History of Theology and Philosophy series, and the University of Notre Dame Press. She and her husband Jay are the parents of 3 children, one of whom is a first-year student here at Holy Cross College, so welcome, Jay. So please help me to welcome Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin.
Hello, friends. So lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming out on a football Friday. I really appreciate it. It's really a great honor to have been invited to address you as part of Dr. Marco Clark's Executive Leadership Series. I look at the list and I think, surely there's been some mistake. Executive leadership, these extraordinarily luminous, accomplished people in their fields. I'm very grateful to Dr. Clark for inviting me, to Mrs. Jody Baden for issuing the invitation, and of course assisting so judiciously with making all the logistical arrangements. Happy to be here not only as a scholar, an administrator, an educator, but also as a Holy Cross parent who threatened my child with public shame if he did not come.
That's true.
Welcome all. My title today is A Pedagogy of Hope, Liberal Education in the Holy Cross Tradition. What I plan to do today is share a little bit about academic and administrative leadership in higher education, especially in the context of Catholic institutions which are built upon the ideals put forward in Saint John Henry Newman's educational writings. These are ideals which get invoked directly by John Paul II's Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which is the apostolic constitution on Catholic universities. And I think Newman's pedagogy and the pedagogy that is put forward in Ex Corde is of course deeply resonant with the pedagogy of Holy Cross luminaries like Blessed Basil Moreau and others that Dr. Clark enumerated, and the charism of Basil Moreau and Holy Cross as a whole, which absolutely animates and I think illuminates our shared tri-campus community. So before I get too far into the ideals and best practices of pedagogy in Catholic liberal education and some possible leadership principles that might follow from these, what I would like to do first is provide a little bit of context about exactly the kind of work that I do across the street at Notre Dame in terms of scholarship as a professional theologian, teaching in both the Department of Theology and the Program of Liberal Studies, which is our Great Books major, and then finally in administration as the faculty director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Are there any Soren Fellows in the audience already? All right, good, nice to see you, thanks for being here. Okay, the next thing I'll do after some biographical sharing is take a closer look at some of John Henry Newman's reflections on Catholic liberal education, with paying particular attention to the resonances between Newman and the Holy Cross tradition. And then finally, I'll turn to Pope Leo XIV's new letter on Catholic liberal education, which was released just a few weeks ago while Dr. Clark and I were both in Rome. It was entitled Drawing New Maps of Hope. And then if there's sufficient time and some interest, I hope to be able to engage in some open conversation with Dr. Clark as well as members of the audience about some of these themes. So let's begin. Let's talk about scholarship and teaching. So as an associate professor in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, with a Ph.D. in systematic theology, I put the definition of systematic theology there because everyone's always like, what is systematic theology anyway? So there it is, in case you were wondering. My own research and publication record is very deeply interdisciplinary. It brings together the fields of theology with literature, philosophy, the arts, aesthetics. In theology, I often teach my courses on ecclesiology, which of course is the study of the church, theological aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, creativity, and perception, Catholic tradition, and the development of doctrine and figures like John Henry Newman, and of course a bit later, thinkers affiliated with the ressourcement theology, which is a movement which prioritized a return to patristic and medieval sources, as well as a return to the original unity of theology with spirituality and spiritual practice, and liturgical practice. One of the greatest joys of my scholarly career to date was my involvement in Saint John Henry Newman's cause to be elevated to Doctor of the Church, which was made official in St. Peter's Square just a few weeks ago in St. Peter's Square on November the 1st. You can see here a picture of the red book is called a positio. This is where all of our essays, which were arguing for the eminence of Newman's doctrine, were put, and then this book was distributed to the cardinals, which was then distributed to the Pope. The top picture is the contributors to the positio, many theologians from across the world who assembled in Rome together with the cardinal for the dicastery of faith and causes, and then below you see a picture of Pope Leo accepting an icon of John Henry Newman with Father George Bowen, who was the postulator for the cause, in the background there. I asked my colleague Chris Morelli, who's in the picture, what was it like? You gave the Pope an icon, and what did he say? And apparently the first thing he said was, "Let's take the plastic off," which I thought was pretty good. Pope Leo being eminently practical. So this is, we can talk a little bit more about that process if you are interested in my own contribution to that positio. I actually thought this was kind of nice. I ran into your president and his lovely wife and the chair of your philosophy department outside of St. Peter's Basilica. We were sitting just a few rows from one another. So we were there for the Mass for Newman in St. Peter's Square, which was a lovely moment of bringing Holy Cross and Notre Dame to the Universal Church. So in addition to the work that I do in theology, I'm also jointly appointed in the program of liberal studies. The short acronym is PLS. This is Notre Dame's historic great books major, established in the tradition of Mortimer Adler, St. John's College, core text programs at Columbia University, the University of Chicago. It's like that because it has a fully integrated and all required and very discussion-rich curriculum of primarily Socratic style seminar pedagogy. So we get together, we read text and translation in very small groups, discussion-based. The major is celebrating its 75th anniversary. It was founded back in 1950 by a group of scholars animated by an explicitly Catholic vision and having a particular set of presuppositions about what liberal education is, its purpose, the integration of the disciplines within a Catholic manifold. I think in many liberal arts colleges and universities like Holy Cross and Notre Dame, we really aim to decenter the outcome of transmitting information and instead privilege these dynamic processes of formation and the holistic cultivation of moral and intellectual persons. So to form rather than to inform. We read, as I said, a common canon of primary texts. We read Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, Dostoevsky, Darwin, Tolstoy, Cervantes, Wittgenstein, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Ralph Ellison. Basically, we start with with the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we read chronologically through the modern novel. So many more besides these that I've enumerated are on our seminar lists. I think the ideal goals of this kind of teaching is that students will learn to express themselves, to write with fluency or elegance, to learn a kind of a quickness of mind, and I think in the best cases, which are always kind of sacred ground to witness, experience the quickening of a heart that is moved and even elevated by encounters with beauty and goodness and truth. So that's what I do on a daily basis. And we might ask, we've had a number of different, your class has had a number of different leaders in different sectors, in the business sector, in the corporate sector, in politics, and here I am in education. So wondering what leadership and what that looks like in the realm of scholarship and teaching. I think it looks like a number of different things. Maybe the most obvious is it looks like high-level publications. It looks like research, which extend theological inquiry in monographs, single-author books, in academic journals, in collections of essays. Here's a sampling of some of the books that I've written or contributed to. But what's important, I think, about that research and scholarship, as Dr. Clark said, it's not for one's own glory or one's own adding a line to a CV, but I always go back to what Ex Corde Ecclesiae says. We ought to, any institution of higher learning ought to be characterized by a particular kind of excellence and care, because it embraces what this document has called Catholicism's kind of universal humanism, right? We ought to be interested in things because they're true and interesting in themselves, because they show the truth of God and induct us into the truth of God. And I think by means of this very broad vision, to quote from Ex Corde, a Catholic university is completely dedicated to the research of all aspects of truth in their essential connection with the supreme truth, who is God. I mean, we have to never lose sight of that we're not merely thinking about global rankings or about filling out a CV or about teaching a class, but we are orienting our scholarly lives toward the supreme truth, who is God. Ex Corde goes on and says, it does this without fear, but rather with enthusiasm, dedicating itself to every path of knowledge. So that's one way that we can think about leadership, I think, in the scholarly life. The other thing that I think we need to think about together is that leadership in education ought to be correlated with really excellent and attentive and student-centered teaching. Ex Corde extols the virtues of Catholic institutions of higher learning as dedicated to excellent pedagogy characterized by, quote, students who freely associate with their teachers in a common love of knowledge. Thus, leadership in scholarship and teaching is not always, or even most importantly, publishing in splashy venues or delivering named lectures, coming over to the Driscoll Auditorium and having your name on a poster, but often that leadership is like what Dr. Clark was speaking of with this imitatio Christi, right? That is invisible and thankless in a lot of ways. It's long hours advising, it's reading bad dissertation drafts, it's serving on committees, it's coaching students through job interviews, and it's any display of accompaniment and care, right? Those kinds of things that you can't quite put on a CV. So in my view, in education, there's one principle above all else, right? And here it is on the slide. A principle that resonates, I think, with the Holy Cross charism, which is at the heart of both of our institutions. And of course, that principle is love. Francis, I think, said it most simply, and therefore, because most simply, most compellingly, you cannot teach without loving. That means that educators must love their subject matter and their students, inviting them to take up this quest for truth, which alone can satisfy the longings of the human heart. So, scholarship and teaching. Finally, administration. I serve as the third faculty director of the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. This is a 26-year-old scholarly center on the campus of Notre Dame, committed to sharing the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and public engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. The center was founded in 1999, deliberately in line with the charism of Pope John Paul II, especially animated by Veritatis Splendor, Evangelium Vitae, Fides et Ratio, and Excordia Ecclesiae, which I've already mentioned. In line with these encyclicals, our center defends a humanist, integrated view of the human person and human flourishing. It resists narrow, reductive, or technocratic understandings, either of the human being or of ethics. In keeping with the views of John Paul II and the thought of Alistair McIntyre, who was our permanent research fellow in residence at the DCEC until his death this past May at the tender old age of 96, we take the position that questions of ethics and moral inquiry cannot be considered abstracted from communities of practice and in the context of human relations of mutual interdependence. Moreover, we are committed to the understanding that human beings are subjects with infinite worth and dignity, created imago Dei, and thereby whose dignity is independent of what such persons can produce or do, which of course is important for the most fragile, vulnerable persons on the margins of life, especially the unborn, the very ill, and the dying. The principle that undergirds all of our programming, from research and publications to student formation to culture of life work, is the sense that, quote, integral human formation in the Catholic tradition rests in the conviction that human persons are made in the image and likeness of God, and that their final end is communion with God. This theological anthropology understands human persons to be endowed with a rational nature, to be naturally inclined toward the transcendent, and to be nourished most fully through participation in the life of the Catholic Church. So what does our center do? Well, we run conferences, host lectures, support faculty hiring and visiting scholars, offer dedicated pro-life programming, administer 4 different book series at the University of Notre Dame Press, and have a robust student formation program. This includes such activities as academic lectures, pilgrimages to holy sites and sites of historical, literary, and artistic significance, liturgies, regular prayer. One time we had an English country dance inspired by Jane Austen novels. We've had Shakespeare monologue competitions, right? It's a celebration of all that the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual and aesthetic tradition has to offer. We want to help our students build lives of human flourishing and virtuous intellectual friendships. We want to encourage vocations. I think last year we had seven of our sermon fellows go into religious life. We want to create and sustain a joyful community of Catholic life together. One of the things, my very favorite event that we do, this was taken just a few weeks ago, of our annual fall conference. This is such a jubilant celebration of the Catholic intellectual tradition. It draws maybe 1,000 or more participants every year. This year, our theme was that which I also received, living tradition. We welcomed a number of quite distinguished speakers. We had Philippe Villeneuve, who was the chief architect of historic monuments in France. He was the one who was responsible for the rescue and reconstruction and restoration of Notre Dame de Paris Cathedral after the devastating fire in 2019. We had Zena Hitz. She's the author of Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. And we had the newly elected vice president of the USCCB, Bishop Daniel Flores, who gave an extraordinary prophetic, mystical sort of call to Catholic life in this lecture here. And it's not just academic either. It's aesthetic, it's spiritual, it has to do with beauty. We had performances from Palestrina. We had a shape note, Sacred Heart demonstration of singing, where we were all singing in 4-part harmony. We had presentations from the prior of San Clemente Basilica in Rome about some of the new archaeological digs and discoveries he's finding in those ruins, and presentations on Caravaggio, immigration. Really, it's a full spate of topics. I really do hope you'll come next year because it gives a good example of the kinds of breadth that we're interested in. And then finally, I have a captive audience, and I hope you'll indulge me to reiterate the standing invitation to all the Holy Cross students. We really want you to apply for the Soren Fellows program. We really want you to be with us. We want our communities to be even more united than they already are. So if you somehow don't know about the Soren Fellows program, it is a community, as the slide says, of undergraduate, graduate, and professional students at the University of Notre Dame, St. Mary's College, and Holy Cross College, inspired by the richness of the Catholic moral and and intellectual tradition, and committed to pursuing truly integral development in the context of collegiate experience and in the discernment of vocations. Through the student formation program, Soren Fellows are provided opportunities to consider enduring and contemporary issues through the lens of the Catholic tradition, to encounter role models and befriend mentors, to nourish your intellectual and interior lives and appreciation for the spiritual heritage of the Catholic Church, and to discern and cultivate gifts and talents through grant fundings and internships. So the grants that we offer are to send, if you want to go walk the Camino, if you want to go on a pilgrimage, if you want to go look in an archive, if you're doing a research project here at Holy Cross and you need some funding to go to a museum somewhere, we want to be able to help you and to help cultivate this holistic formation. This is what fundamentally it means, I think, to me as the director of this center, integral human formation, and Holy Cross is certainly a part of that. You can see this picture here. I believe this was taken from the pilgrimage a few years ago to the UK, where students went and visited sites that were important for Tolkien and Chesterton and John Henry Newman, visiting literary sites, going to see Newman's rooms, looking at various kind of points of literary and theological history. So it's always wonderful. We went to Rome last year, and hopefully we'll have another pilgrimage planned shortly. Okay. So now that you know about me, that's a long time to tell you what I do. But I want to talk a little bit about Newman, because Newman's the best, and because he has a lot to say about Catholic education. And while I don't think Edward Soren and Blessed Basil Moreau were reading Newman, because they're coming from two different streams. Newman is a Victorian English. Our patrons, Blessed Basil Moreau and Edward Soren, were from this French tradition. I think there's a lot of overlap, and I think there's a lot of potential conversation and discussion that we might have about the nature of education and what education is for. And I think what's interesting to me is that John Henry Newman was just declared just a few weeks ago by Pope Leo the co-patron of education, alongside St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? So Leo wrote this new lecture new encyclical on education called Drawing New Maps of Hope, and in that he declares Newman to be the co-patron of education. Right? So even if you're not, if you don't know much about Newman or think you can kind of get into his thinking, I would really encourage you, especially now that he's become a universal doctor of the Church, which means his teaching is something for everyone, right? This is for everyone, not just scholars of Newman and not just the Victorian 1800s Englishmen. He has something to say to everyone in the universal Church, and he's got a lot to say about education. So let's take a look at some of the texts that Newman wrote about education. So these are not all the only two books that he has listed here, The Idea of a University and Rise and Progress of Universities in the Benedictine Essays, but they are probably some of the most important. So the one on the right, Idea of a University, is a collection of 9 lectures. He calls them discourses. He delivered these in Dublin in 1852. He was asked basically to help to establish the very first modern Catholic university in Ireland. So he was asked to give these lectures in a very difficult context. Ireland had been thinking about banning mixed education. That is, if you know the history of Ireland, there's a lot of tension between Catholics and Protestants. And Newman was brought in to deliver these lectures against this idea of mixed education. That is, that Catholics and Protestants should be educated together. The problem with this in this moment was that in the name of tolerance, or at least kind of purported neutrality, the idea was because religion was too hard to talk about, then theology and all religious training would be entirely eliminated from the curriculum, right? And so Newman was addressing this kind of idea. He makes a very strong case in Idea of a University that theology ought to be included in a curriculum, which I know is a requirement here at Holy Cross, just as it is at Notre Dame. So the first of these 5 lectures get published in pamphlets, and they're distributed, and then they're eventually all bound up together. They were published in the 3rd edition in 1873. And a lot of people, Catholics and non-Catholics, consider this text to be really foundational within the liberal arts tradition of pedagogy. So I want to talk a little bit as well about the distinction that Newman makes between university and collegiate principles, right? I mean, so you have to think about the context in which Newman was writing this, right? He's writing in like Oxford in the UK kind of traditions. So if you know anything about the way Oxford is organized, you have the university, and then within the university you have a number of different colleges where the students would eat together and be formed and this kind of thing. We don't have that model in the United States, and so you have to kind of keep his context in mind when we look at this quote here. But I thought it was interesting to sort of think about how universities and colleges might approach education in these complementary ways. So that is something that I thought we might be able to talk about. So as he's talking, he means at universities, so like Oxford or Cambridge, a university embodies the principle of progress, and a college that of stability. The one is the sail, the other is the ballast. Each is insufficient in itself for the pursuit, extension, and inculcation of knowledge. Each is useful to the other. The university is for the philosophical discourse, the eloquent sermon, or the well-contested disputation, and the college for the catechetical lecture. The university is for theology, law, and medicine, for natural history, for physical science. The college is for the formation of character, intellectual and moral, for the cultivation of the mind, for the improvement of the individual, for the study of literature, for the classics and those rudimental sciences which strengthen and sharpen the intellect. The university, being the element of advance, will fail in making good its ground as it goes. The college, from its conservative tendencies, will be sure to go back. It would seem as if a university seated and living in colleges would be a perfect institution, as possessing excellences of opposite kinds. And now I think in like US kinds of frame, like your institution and my institution, we are kind of called upon to do all of these things together, right? So it's a different model, but I do find it interesting to flag. Sometimes Newman gets criticized for being too speculative. You know, he's talking, what is a university education for? Well, it's for developing a philosophical habit of mind, or this kind of liberal education. But really, he's devoted fundamentally to the formation of character, the intellectual and moral development. So the kinds of things that we want to do as Holy Cross institutions, you see that Newman thought these principles had to live together. The university seated in colleges is the perfect institutions, right? So we have both a kind of interest in research, in progress, but also in the formation of students in their moral and intellectual lives. Okay, I want to say a little bit about what Newman really put forward as major principles for a liberal education. Right? These, a lot of my interest in teaching in the Great Books department is animated by these Newmanian principles for liberal education, and I think in small Catholic colleges like Holy Cross, these principles are also obtaining. First is that knowledge, we presuppose that knowledge is integrated, that knowledge is whole. There's a comprehensiveness and a unity of knowledge. We understand what it is to be educated as to be able to see the relationship between diverse bodies and parts of knowledge, and then to be able to see the relationship between those parts and the whole. The second thing that I think Holy Cross really, as a charism, the Holy Cross pedagogy really excels in, is that education requires personal encounter and community. It's relational. And then finally, this idea that knowledge is its own end, this idea of the liberality of knowledge. Is oriented not toward vocational or professional or practical or spiritual training, at least in the first instance, but it has to do with the cultivation of the intellect. It cannot be made utilitarian, at least in the first instance. It may be that we all get wonderful jobs right out of our liberal arts education, but it is not meant simply for that, right? There's not a kind of crass transactionalism about that kind of education. So the first element or principle for Newman, which I think maybe isn't really the default idea in many modern, certainly secular institutions, this sort of starting point that all the branches of knowledge are actually connected. Because, I mean, this is Newman's rationale, and it's a religious one, it's a theological one, because he says the subject matter of knowledge is intimately united in itself as being the acts and the work of the Creator. And what it is that education gives us, liberal education gives us, is the perfection of the intellect. The way that Newman talks about this is the clear, calm, accurate vision and comprehension of all things, as far as the finite mind can embrace them, each in its place and with its own characteristics upon it. One of the things that I have grown to appreciate about our Great Books program, the program of liberal studies, is that in some of the earlier documents in the 1950s, there's this appeal to Odysseus from the Odyssey, right? You think about Odysseus and all of his practical wisdom, where he can kind of come into a situation, scan whatever weird thing is happening, understand what's going on, and understand how he should intervene. And this is kind of like the goal that our students ought to be able to understand, not simply stuff about stuff in silos, right? To understand like this is how this particular discipline works, but how do we see in this kind of calm way, how can we look on the horizon, look at all these different kind of factors, and understand how they connect together? How can we put them together? Newman talks very much about the truly great intellect. What is it to have a truly great intellect? It's not necessarily getting published in all the best journals, but it's someone who's able to take a connected view of old and new, past and present, far and near, and also to understand not just things, but also their mutual and true relations. Knowledge not merely considered as an acquirement, but as philosophy. All right, the second thing that I think is so important for Newman and so important for Holy Cross education is relationality. He actually said, if I were forced to choose, this is not good for my job prospects, but if I were forced to choose, Newman said, between having a university with very high-level professors who knew a lot and a university with no professors at all, he said he would actually choose no professors at all. Because when a mix of young people, he said, keen and open-hearted and sympathetic and observant come together and mix with each other, they are sure to learn from one another, even if there be no one to teach them. He says knowledge is something more than a sort of passive reception of scraps and details. It is a something, and it does a something, which never will issue from the most strenuous efforts of a set of teachers with no mutual sympathies and no intercommunion. Right? So that's the sort of gift, I think, of a place like Holy Cross College or Holy Cross pedagogy, is that this relational aspect of teaching is so ingrained into the professors, as this is also true at Notre Dame, right? That this idea that there has to be a mutual sympathy between teacher and student. It's not just we're there to like deliver information, but it's relational. It's this principle of accompaniment. And then finally, this idea that knowledge is an end in itself. And we ought not lose sight of that. I mean, I know it can be very difficult to resist these trends of professionalization and vocationalizing everything, making everything into, well, I'm only going to do this if it gets me X or if it gets me Y. But I think we really do need to relish this idea that knowledge is capable, as Newman said, of being its own end. This is what the human mind, this is how we are oriented, right? We have this innate desire for the truth and to pursue it, and there's a kind of longing there that cannot be sated by merely penultimate goods. So Newman says there's a knowledge that's worth possessing for what it is, and not merely for what it does. Okay, a kind of summary here of some of the Newman material. If you have a moment to read Newman, or if you've read him deeply, you will know that he works very, very deeply across his set of texts to integrate faith and reason, right? He can be actually quite difficult to read, but I think it's important for Holy Cross and the pedagogical tradition here as well. This integration of faith and reason, this affirmation of the mind. But for Newman, it's never just that, right? There's this elevation across all of his writings of personal conscience, of discernment, of thinking about vocation. And then, of course, Newman's idea that holistic education has to be of the whole person. It has to be university principles and collegiate principles together. The mind cannot be educated at the expense of the heart, as you know, I'm sure that's said all the time around here. This idea of personal holiness, or as Dr. Clark said, our commitment to some goal, piety, this importance of community, relationships, residential life, this collegiate principle of family, right? I mean, if you think about places like here, places like Notre Dame, where residential life is so important, that's not by accident, right? It is, people say, oh, Notre Dame is like a very big family, and they think that's a Notre Dame thing, but it's a Holy Cross thing. It was a Holy Cross thing first, right? It was this idea that we live in community, that we take care of each other, that there's a kind of like family atmosphere. That's very deliberate from the Holy Cross charism. This idea that education and teaching are motivated by desire, right? I mean, if you don't have that kind of like longing to know, if teachers aren't able to kind of to invite students to feel that desire for truth, then I think we need to do better. This idea that zeal is at the very forefront of Holy Cross pedagogy, to speak with the kind of passion of being inducted into a real quest for truth, something really is actually quite exciting. And then finally, Newman talks a lot about practical wisdom. This idea that he wants students to have this philosophical habit of mind, this Odyssean capacity to come into a situation, make judgments about what's going on, to be measured, to have a kind of equitableness of mind and a freedom to be able to look at things, and then using practical wisdom in the Aristotelian way of talking about that, that's phronesis, to kind of make judgments, right? To sort of make judgments that are based on evidence and the preponderance of evidence, which I think is connected to this competence to see, right, and the courage to act. It's not just that you see, but it's you have this capacity to intervene and to make good judgments. Okay, in my concluding set of slides, I just want to highlight some of Pope Leo XIV's new reflections on education, right, and thinking about education as the place of hope. This is a Jubilee Year of Hope. We have the Notre Dame Newman Forum, or the Notre Dame Forum across the street, Cultivating Hope. And I think that Leo puts education in this frame is also really telling and helpful for us. So, I don't know, has anyone read the document yet? Maybe one person? Okay, good, of course, front row. This idea that education has to be based first on the principles of what it is to be a human person, right? This kind of connection of education with theological anthropology. You can't just educate, like every system of education has an anthropology, whether they admit it or not. And I think this idea that to think about education means that we first have to think about what a human person is. And I think Leo says that from the very beginning of this letter. We get this vision of the human being as an image of God, imago Dei, called to goodness and truth, and all of the ways that education can help to assist our students and our teachers, our faculty, our staff to have life and have it abundantly, to quote from John 10. He says that pedagogy is never disembodied theory. That's a very Holy Cross kind of moment, I think, in this letter. We're not merely thinking about abstractions, right? Education has to do with the real people in these real rooms, with flesh, with passion, and history. And finally, here, Christian education is collective. Nobody educates alone. Later in the letter, he talks about constellations. We have to kind of constellate all of our efforts together. Teachers and students and families and administrative and service staff, pastors, civil society, we educate together. And I think that's an important thing to remember, especially thinking about the relationship even between Holy Cross and Notre Dame. The other thing I think that's super important about this letter is the cultivation of an empathetic and open vision. This idea that desire and the heart must not be separated from knowledge. That, Leo says, would be splitting the person. Catholic universities and schools are places where questions are not silenced and doubt is not banished, but accompanied, right? That notion of accompaniment here in the letter. The heart, dialogue with the heart, and the method is that of listening that recognizes the other as an asset, not a threat. And of course, I really love that he quotes Newman all over this letter, core and core, this idea that heart speaks to heart, that we cannot, again, educate the mind at the expense of the heart. This idea as well that when we educate, education is intrinsically an act of hope. It is a renewed passion because, as Leo says, it manifests the promise we see in the future of humanity. The specificity, depth, and breadth of educational action is the work, as mysterious as it is real, of making the being flourish, taking care of the soul. It is a profession of promises. I love these lines. It promises time, confidence, skill. It promises justice and mercy. It promises the courage of the truth and the balm of consolation. Educating is a labor of love that is handed down from generation to generation, mending the torn fabric of relations and restoring the weight of promise to words. Every man is capable of truth, yet the journey is much more bearable when it goes forward with the help of another. Truth is sought in community. All right, last quote from Leo, but I love this because it really gets at the heart of what we try to do in the theology department, in the program of liberal studies, and at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, is that Christian formation must embrace the entire person, spiritual, intellectual, emotional, social, and physical. It does not pit manual and theoretical skills, science and humanism, technology and conscience against each other. Rather, it demands that professionalism be imbued with ethics, and that ethics be not an abstract concept, but a daily practice. Education does not measure its value only on the axis of efficiency. It measures it according to dignity, justice, the capacity to serve the common good. This integral anthropological vision must remain the cornerstone of Catholic pedagogy. Following in the wake of the thought of Saint John Henry Newman, it goes against a strictly mercantilist approach that often forces education today to be measured in terms of functionality and practical utility. Right? This idea very much from Newman in concert with what we've already seen from the idea of a university. Okay, I'm quoting here from a document that was shared with me by Dr. Clark on this module that he mentioned at the beginning of your class, where he enumerates these seven principles: zeal, piety, humble servanthood, the competence to see, the courage to act, entrepreneurial magnanimity, and accompaniment. And I've kind of listed some things here that we might talk about, if you'd like, in the discussion period. But I think as a scholar and as an administrator in higher education, I think these are some of the principles that come out, at least in my own context. Right, you first have to have an extraordinary intellectual curiosity, right? You can't always be the smartest person in the room, right? You have to understand what other people are saying, what you might learn. You have to commit very strongly to the union of faith and reason, and the desire and longing for the truth. You have to take an integrated and holistic view of all persons, especially students, right? To think they're not just intellects. They need to live in community. They need to be formed socially and liturgically and intellectually in terms of virtuous friendships. I think there's something about, I keep coming back to the Odyssean image of being able to see all at once. And I think there's something important about leadership that allows you to have a strategic vision and a strategic plan, right? You can't just sort of wake up and put the fire that's in front of you out, because there's always going to be fires. You have to be able to kind of stand above the fray, look at everything that you're dealing with, and be able to articulate a vision for the organization that you're running or for the department that you're in. I think this idea of educating in community comes out by the deliberate building of strong relationships and networks with other people, which includes, I think, developing not only your own gifts and strengths, but deliberately developing the gifts and the strengths of other people, which includes really sort of cultivating emotional intelligence and these interpersonal relationships. And I think the most important thing is this idea of the imitatio Christi, this idea of humble servanthood. Because it's not, certainly those of you who are professors or administrators know that it's not really a glamorous sort of job, right? A lot of it is putting in the hours, and it's being humble, being close to the earth, right? Not needing to be glorified in any way. So I think that's an important thing. A final, just a kind of encouragement to those of you who are in the class, who are thinking about leadership or thinking about your own careers, thinking about vocation. At Notre Dame, we teach a course for all freshmen in the Moreau freshman seminar, and our final class is on vocation. We read a bunch of different texts, but one of the ones I think that's most beautiful is from Thomas Merton, and he's talking about vocation as the union of two friendships and the union of two freedoms, the union of two loves, right? Sometimes we have this idea that vocation is something that is thrust upon you and you will hate it, and it's everything that you just despise. But I think what Merton does is he says, what is that thing that gives you life? What is the thing that really makes you feel free and feel most yourself? And that's where you can kind of identify your vocation, because it matches with the desires, the most intimate desires of your heart. I think Newman he gives us some nice text here, that God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. Right? So this idea, I think, very beautifully, that Saint and our Doctor of the Church, Newman, gives us on education, that everyone is called to do some definite service, and yet also everyone is called to be a link in a chain, right? Because we're not doing it all on our own. Give you one last kind of imperative from Pope Leo's letter, which I keep coming back to this image. Pope Leo, with the letter that I've been talking about from October, last few weeks ago, he says, teachers and students, be choreographers of hope. So I think that's a really compelling way of thinking about the pedagogical enterprise. What does it mean to be a choreographer of hope? What does it mean to kind of join in this dance that is oriented to futurity and to promise and to this kind of eschatological vision where all will be restored? How do we kind of play into this idea of choreographers of hope? So that's a lot of Newman and a lot of Leo, but I want to maybe invite Dr. Clark up. We can have more conversation about some of his own thoughts on education, as well as take some questions from the audience and just have a broader discussion for the last little bit. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. So we will invite questions from the audience, but a couple of comments, I think, first. Wow, thank you. And I've spent over 30 years of my career working with the Congregation of Holy Cross, and have prided myself on becoming more deeply steeped and rooted in this mission and charism, this educational mission and charism. And I just couldn't help but see the many, many parallels that you pointed out with Newman's teachings, right? Coming from two different countries, two different times, two different sets of circumstances, and yet those parallels and this pedagogy of hope. A lot of people, the very root of the word pedagogy, peda is for child, and gaji is for leading. And so often when I see the word teach, and when I see the word education, I have this tendency in my mind to substitute the word leadership, lead and leadership in there. So as you were going through those quotes, I might even ask the students after we share your PowerPoint on, I'll upload it for you into Moodle, but take a look and just substitute the word lead or leadership in there for teach or education, right? And see kind of where that brings you. And we'll close out in a few minutes with something that I love to close these sessions with. So I want to start off just with this question. First off, so Dr. Martin and I, we were a few rows from each other in St. Peter's Square a few weeks ago. We happened to be there at the All Saints Day Mass on November the 1st when Saint John Henry Newman was declared a doctor of the church. You pointed out that you were a part of the team that helped that process to evolve. So I wonder if you could just walk us through where did that begin? You yourself were a scholar in Newman. You were joined with other scholars. What an honor to be invited. How did that happen? What length of time did you spend to do this? What's the process? Only the 38th doctor in the 2,000-year history of our church. So I wonder if you could just walk us through that process.
Absolutely. It's like I said, I'm pretty sure that my career is all downhill from here, because this was pretty much peak theology nerd behavior kind of thing. So yes, it was extraordinary to be involved. As you pointed out, to be named doctor of the church does not happen very often, right? So in 2,000 years of Christian history, 38 doctors of the church as of All Saints Day this past year. What it is to be a doctor of the church, I mean, that you think about the root of that word, docere, right, to teach, right? This idea that the teaching of this saint is so clear and so efficacious and so So good for the life of the universal church that the declaration is that this theologian, this saint, should be elevated in this way, not only for their own kind of theological prowess, but also their personal piety. So you can kind of think about it in those terms. But in terms of the process, it predated me by quite a few years. I mean, I think it's probably gone on for maybe 3 or 4 years. Basically, the bishops of England and Wales began the cause to petition for doctrine of the church. And so they got connected with a different postulator, and they said, we want to open this cause. And then those bishops connected with a priest from the Birmingham Oratory. You saw his picture here, Father George Bowen, and he helped connect those bishops with a group here in the U.S., the National Institute for Human Studies, NINS, and they helped to organize all the theologians. They invited different chapters, basically in this giant book, this positio, to enumerate aspects of Newman's thought. And our instructions were, don't approach this like an academic, right? Don't say anything new, don't put any weird footnotes, don't do anything, don't try to get fancy. Just tell us what Newman said and how it was, and how it might be efficacious for the whole universal church. And so my chapter was on the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, this kind of instinct that the faithful have for the truth of the gospel and what Newman had to say about that, as well as his elevation of the laity, which was picked up in Vatican II, right? So he's very important for the Second Vatican Council. And then that was part of the positio. The first part are letters from different bishops across the world attesting to Newman's reach and Newman's eminence of his teaching. And then that gets, again, like I said, sent to the cardinals deliberate and vote upon it, and then it gets sent to the Pope. Pope Francis was very enthusiastic about it, but unfortunately passed away before he was able to declare Newman a doctor of the church. But there's a certain kind of loveliness, I think, in the fact that it was Leo XIII who made Newman a cardinal, and Leo XIV who made Newman a doctor. So there's a certain kind of bookend quality, which seems right and just.
So I had the privilege of sitting a few rows behind this group of theologians who have spent years of their professional careers advancing this cause, and there were tears when Newman's picture was revealed there behind the altar at St. Peter's Square. There was that sense of joy and pride, and I just really enjoyed soaking all of that up. And I couldn't help as well but think, as you were talking about the time that Newman wrote the idea of a university, the Irish system at the time, that I think you said that they removed theology from instruction. Is that correct? They wanted to, okay, but they didn't end up doing that. Okay, so there was obvious divisiveness. Historically, there have been for hundreds of years in Ireland among Protestants and Catholics, and but again, education is the link, especially hopeful Christian education, just like Moreau talks about. It is the link to prepare for better times, right? They can't remove theology from that. Really interested by that. So, okay, so I've got other questions, but I want to see if there's any other questions, any questions that are out there from any of you. There has to be. Here we go, James.
So we've been operating on a sort of consistency of language of educators educating naturally. What can we take from this as students from a position of educating, or what kind of directives can we take to further educate each other, just as the sort of collegiate quality of community? How can we really dig into that?
Great question. I think that Newman is so conscious of his students all the time, and he's thinking always and everywhere of the sort of intricate, complex human being that comes into his classrooms as a student, right? And so much of it, he's actually talking about students so much of the time. What is it that we want from our students? Well, we want them to have a philosophical habit of mind. We want them to be able to talk to one another, to sort of elevate. So he says a series of conversations is a set of lectures for each, right? So the conversations that interesting, very intellectually curious pious students have with one another, there's actually a way in which you're educating one another, right? And so like that you have this kind of very high view of what education is and does, right? If you really like accept this idea that education is fundamentally a transformative enterprise, and it's not just that, you know, we're opening up your brains and pouring in what you need to go be, you know, this job or that job, right? This is, you were being cultivated, you were allowing yourself to be cultivated, and you were cultivating yourselves with your reading and your attention and your capacity to listen with sympathy and to argue civilly and all of those kinds of things, intellectual habits of mind. I mean, I think being open to that and like not being cynical about what education is, right? I mean, to really embrace this idea that, yes, I'm being sort of formed in this way, I'm standing on sacred ground in a way that there's something like really beautiful, I think, about this idea that you take yourself seriously enough as an intellect and as a learner and as a Catholic or a Christian to say, like, you know, this excellence is, this is what we are called to. This is not merely a means to an end. This is a way of engaging in the infinite desire of the God who desires me to desire communion with him and truth and goodness and beauty, right? I mean, that's a high calling. And that to me seems like, if we can be open to that as students and as professors and as staff and as administration, then a rising tide will lift all ships. I don't know if you agree or have something to add.
Yeah, well, I love it, and I think that Moreau as well, this sentiment of relationality that you pointed to as the second component important for Newman's theory there on the idea of the university, but that sense of relationality is inherent, the sense of community. We talk about it as family. The Congregation of Holy Cross was founded in the image of the Holy Family, and we as educational institutions are also called to exist as family, and so that's why you have learning, living communities like Holy Cross College. That's why you have res hall life like you do at the University of Notre Dame. And we're fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Chris Howe, who is Assistant Provincial for the U.S. Province of Priests and Brothers, and in his role he works with the with the Holy Cross Higher Education Network of our 8 colleges and universities nationwide, and these are principles that you see, Chris, I'm sure, at every one of these campuses. Moreau said that we will stand to learn as much from one another as we do from our instructors. So I think that's a part of it as well. And so to be open as students, and we as teachers always to be open as learners along the way. So that's, I think, part of that takeaway too. I think we're constantly learning, but I also think that within every one of us, within every one of you, whether you're 18 or 22 or we're in our 60s, right? Within every one of you have the ability to bring hope and healing to the world, and we do that through the way we teach and lead and interact from heart to heart. Let the Jesus in your heart see the Jesus in others' hearts, right? And that's part of what we're called to do and be as Holy Cross people, as Holy Cross leaders. So that's part of the way that I see it as well. Our provost, Dr. Griffin, when you were talking about us being on sacred ground, I knew that you were just heating that up.
Exactly. I just want to first say it is really an honor, Jenny, to have you here. Thanks for being here. And so my question has to do with the idea of the university as a collection of colleges. So we have a technical question about one of your points, and then one very grounded here at Holy Cross College. The technical question is, at one point I thought you said something like the university is seeded by colleges. And I didn't know if you meant like seeded S-E-E-D-E-D or S-E-A-T-E, but that sense that that a university is comprised of colleges. And I think the technical question is, what do you see as the importance of that ecosystem of not just this abstract university, which, you know, in today's landscape, some kind of call it multiversity, where in some places they don't have, there's no cohering idea. What can the role of colleges be in a technical sense? And then for us, here we are, especially in these last 7-8 years, really finding our place in the tri-campus and our consciousness as being a college within a larger university ecosystem. And so that question is this, is as someone knows Holy Cross well and loves Holy Cross College well, what do you see emerging as maybe one or two of our unique gifts as a college within the larger Notre Dame, Indiana University ecosystem?
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Beautiful questions, of course. So yes, I mean, so Newman, that was a quote from Newman, and it's seated, S-E-A-T-E-D, and that's from Newman. So, right, I mean, as he's thinking, I love that you pointed out this, the multiversity, because in very many ways, that is what it feels like, right? In lots of different institutions, which don't start from this foundational principle that knowledge is actually united fundamentally in the mind of God and all of these kinds of, it's a very sort of theological starting point. But sometimes, even at places like Notre Dame, sometimes the left hand knows not what the right hand is doing. You have these different departments who are doing different things, and it just seems like, in what way are we seeing all together or seeing all at once? And so I really do appreciate you bringing that language up. But what Newman was after is, if the goal of a university, like the fundamental telos of a university, is the cultivation of the intellect, which requires, Newman was actually pretty down on researching. He didn't think professors ought to go out and research, but professors should teach. That's what professors should do. And it's not, so it's a different model than a kind of research university model in the States where, teaching is only 1/3 of our job and we have to produce original scholarship all the time. Newman was actually that doesn't seem like as important as the teaching. So it's a different model, as we have pointed out, but if the university is the cultivation of the intellect, and if knowledge is its own end, then Newman basically argues in Idea of a University that universities are not meant to cultivate virtue. So that is not the primary goal of a university. A university is to cultivate the intellect and the philosophical habit of mind, but sometimes we can mistake a kind of elite, kind of gentlemanly, that he talks about a university that produces not the Catholic nor the Christian, but the gentleman. And he says the gentleman is someone who does no harm. He is able to kind of move in society, he at that point, but he or she in our context, someone who's able to know what to say and when to say it, but he said that sometimes we can mistake that kind of polish for virtue. And he thinks that's a kind of devastating counterfeit. He says, conscience can't just be oh, I want everyone to think I'm a good person, and that I'm a good member of society and I contribute to society in my way. But conscience has to be does your heart convict you if you are in sin, right? I mean, so it becomes a very different conversation. So he's we can't expect knowing things to turn us into virtuous persons, right? There's this great line where he says, you can quarry you can quarry with a silk thread, and you have just as much luck unrooting the vice at the heart of the human heart with knowledge alone, right? So I think maybe he's very strong on this. And so, but he says, no, the college is for moral formation. The college is for stability. The college is for the improvement of the individual and the formation. But we, of course, as the director of the Nicola Center, I care very much about my students and their formation and the formation of virtue, right? And so I think for both the college, Holy Cross College and Notre Dame, we are called to kind of do both of these things. But I mean, again, the system was quite different for Newman. The second question, I mean, I love Holy Cross. What I always say about Holy Cross College is, you know exactly who you are. There's no kind of, there's no waffling about that. I think I've heard Dr. Clark say, we are small, so we are supple. We are able to kind of move in the sea, in this kind of very supple way because we're small and we're agile. And I think the thing that, at least as a Holy Cross parent and as a kind of a booster for Holy Cross in general, that I think that this institution brings is precisely that unabashed sense of Catholic mission and identity, in the sense that the charism from your leadership and from your professors There's not a whiff of presumption about any of it, right? It's like we are here for the students. We are here to sort of pour ourselves out for the experience of these students. And I think there's something, you're like a beacon on the hill in a way to say like, this is what education is for, right? Education is for walking together, accompanying our students, learning together, letting our sort of desires for truth be sharpened, against one another in these communities of inquiry. And it's, you're not distracted by, in the same way as a larger institution would be, by metrics or like, I know you care about those things too, but it's like the teaching is the thing. Newman would like that, right? The teaching is what college professors and university professors should do.
Well, thank you. And completely edifying to hear you say those words. Thank you, especially in front of our board chair, Mr. John Gershwin. Thank you, John, for being with us today. John is not only chair of the board here, but also serves on the advisory council at Nicola. And so I know it's a treat for you to be here. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
You can.
So Jenny, I'm very curious with the rise and growing presence of technology in our society. This year's buzzword is artificial intelligence. How should a liberal education of Holy Cross tradition evolve, if at all? And what should it avoid as technology takes on a greater role in society?
That's not hard at all. That's the question. That's a hard question. I think we all have to be careful as educators and as learners and as lifelong learners, not to model our own thoughts about what thinking is and what knowledge is on a machine. And I think we're actually kind of always in great danger of doing that. Like when we say, the large language model or ChatGPT or the computer is thinking, I think we need to know it is not thinking, it is compiling data points, it is compiling information. There is no sort of interiority of a chatbot. There is no interiority that is expressed like in a human thought. And so sometimes I think we think of our own means of learning or our own knowledge or our own sort of brains and minds as merely functioning like machines. Like you put information in, we give information out, right? But instead, we have to take, it's very Newmanian in a sense too. We have to understand knowledge as being very complex, it is very intuitive, it is very embodied, it is in these kind of concrete contexts of practice and life, which I just think if we begin to think of our own processes of thinking as abstract or contextless or relationless, that I can just kind of deliver information without being in these complicated communities of practice where we're always enmeshed together. I think that's the difficulty, right? And I think if we can, this is a big challenge, right? If a large language model or ChatGPT can produce a paper in 5 minutes that it would take, a student or me, 5 days to produce through a lot of agony. Writing is very difficult, but there's something, that process is like writing and thinking are kind of co-located or happening all at once. This kind of struggle for knowledge, this kind of delight in putting your own thought after lots of struggle into just the perfect word, which expresses that kind of interior idea or state, right? Otherwise we are giving away the capacity, the human capacity, because the goals are not the products, the goals aren't the paper, the goal is not, some penultimate thing, the thinking is the thing. That's what Newman would say for sure, it's the cultivation of the intellect. Think about that word cultivation, right? I'm come from farming stock and a farming people, and I think about how long it takes to prepare the soil, to plant a seed, to let it grow, to harvest it, all of those things, that it takes time and it takes effort. And I think if we're selling ourselves way too short. I'm just sort of get off my lawn, but I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I I think that's kind of part of how I would start to think about an answer.
So Dr. Griffin, we may have our partner as we look for our AI in higher education grant through Lilly. We begin to think through how we can hopefully be a force for good as well throughout Catholic education. It's one of the thoughts that we have, and maybe be a leader in AI in Catholic education. Yeah, so maybe we'll talk more about that. Dr. Sloan?
Yes, I wanted to follow up with some of this big conversation. And I think something that Newman has to teach us, even right here at a place like Notre Dame. I've spent 35 years teaching at Notre Dame. I also had experience teaching as an adjunct for Holy Cross College. And what I was impressed with in teaching for Holy Cross College was how much more seriously I felt Holy Cross College was taking with the general question of education. And I think that where part of the danger here that I think Newman recognized in distinguishing between the university or the research institute and the college is that if we fail to separate those activities, so the research model gets pressed further down into the undergraduate education, so that our ideal becomes educating undergraduates to be research scholars, losing the whole notion of the college itself. And I think Newman is very important to keep it. And I think there's a very practical dimension to that. And that is that the real support of universities, even a place like Notre Dame, is not necessarily coming from the research scholars they produce in the graduate level. It's coming from the undergraduate people that they have educated. And if we lose track of the fact that the formation of that group is crucial to the real maintenance of what is great about a university, I think we really lose something. So I think Newman has something to teach us theoretically here, but also something very practical, that we really need to think about what it is we do at the undergraduate level, at the college level, as distinct from the graduate research level. And I think Newman is one of the best people to make that distinction for us. And I think Holy Cross College is a good example, as Dr. Martin has said, of what it is to keep the college ideal alive.
I absolutely agree, and I think we can say to Dr. Sloan here, as colleagues in a program of liberal studies in our Great Books department, is that in many respects, I think that PLS kind of functions as a college within a university, right? Because it is this very holistic, integrated education, which is very student-centric, where we are, we're reading Plato, we're reading the Apology, we're reading Homer, and it's very student-oriented, right? And the papers that they produce, it's really about extending thought and extending their capacity for critical reasoning and for appreciation of a beautiful turn of phrase or whatever. So there is something there, I think, in PLS, which also preserves the collegiate principle as Newman articulates it, and I hope that we continue that tradition.
There's a question in the back too. Well, we wait, and that's what Moreau talked so much about too, was that it was education and formation. It was never just education, never just formation. It was always education and formation. I think he might have used the terms education and instruction, and the instruction was on a way to live. The education was on the intellect, right? The mind and the heart. That's a holistic approach.
Which is why we need the university and the collegiate principles bound together all the time. Yeah, for sure.
My question is, I really love the final quote from Leo XIV about being choreographers of hope. What are some ways that we as students here at Holy Cross or in our local communities, or even when we go into our careers, that we can be choreographers of hope to others around us?
That's a beautiful question. I mean, I think in many ways those are questions that you are in a better position to answer than I am. But I think there's I don't know, I think that the way that Leo talks about this, the way that Newman kind of thinks about hope, he talks about hope in a lot of ways relative to Our Lady, to Mary as the seat of wisdom. I'm actually flying to Ireland on Monday to go give a talk in Newman's University Church, which he designed. And if you've ever been there or seen pictures, there's this picture in the apse of Mary, and she's surrounded by kind of flora and fauna and all of this kind of organic, vines that are kind of coming from her. There's the martyrs are kind of coming. There's animals that kind of have their feet, flowers everywhere, and it kind of spills out into the ceiling. And Newman talks about Mary as being celebrated in the month of May because Mary is bringing this kind of springtime. She's connected with hope and with newness and things kind of constantly being reinvented and renewed and reinvigorated. And I think there's a way of learning and a way of educating and a way of being in the world that kind of speaks to that capacity of Mary's newness and kind of her capacity to sort of protect and sustain life. And I think, I'm only 45, but I think like young people who were kind of like able to kind of like give us this sense of the new and hopefulness and thinking like, how are you going to orient your life according to the future? How are you investing now in your future self? How are you cultivating your intellect? How are you cultivating your relationships? How are you able to kind of to sort of think about your life extended, not kind of like, I know how tempting it is when you're in college, especially when it's November, and you think, oh, I would just have to get through X, I've got to get through exams, I've got to get through this paper, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. But if there's a way of kind of thinking about the newness of your education and the sort of like giftedness of what we have here together in these communities, I think there's something kind of beautiful there about the gratitude for the gifts that we're given. Newman also says of Mary, this is a little bit of an aside, but says that Moses looked upon the face of God once, but Mary looked upon the face of God every day for 33 years, and therefore she is the most philosophical of the philosophers and the most theological of the theologians, because she's able to kind of like understand the kind of deep mysteries of Christ's presence. And I think that's part of it too, to kind of live in hope, is also to be very aware that we are connected with a living font of the life of Christ through his mother. And I don't know, that's not nothing.
It's not nothing. And I think, so the Nicola Center was kind enough to invite me a few weeks ago to give a talk at their Bread of Life dinner, and I spoke specifically on that John 10:10 scripture verse that Jesus says, I came so that you might have life and have it abundantly. And again, I think inherent in every single one of us is to bring hope and healing to the world. And we're all made in Christ in God's likeness and image as creators and as people who bring hope and healing to the world, right? So if Christ says, I came so that you may have life and have it abundantly, I believe that what all of us need to do is in every moment that we encounter others is to seek to bring life and bring it abundantly to others. So for me, in a very simplistic manner, that to me is the cultivation of hope. That's how we do that. How can you, in a college community, in a classroom, in your dorm, right, walking across campus, how can we try to be for one another Christ? How can we help others to live and life and have that life abundantly in the moment, right? In the moment. And we live moment by moment. So to me, it's about encounter. It's a culture. It's having a culture of encounter and recognizing the power within each of you in that encounter. I think Dr. Monta has a question, but as we make the microphone that way, go ahead and please make the microphone that way. I will share a story with you. So Dr. Sloan and I, we go to daily mass together at St. Joe on Hill Street. And there is a gentleman there, Kevin, is his name, who goes to Mass with us every day. And Kevin, after Mass, joins the group of retired men and women that gather for coffee and discussion. He joins them for coffee and Danish and discussion about the day's readings. Kevin is homeless. Kevin sits behind me at Mass every day. I show up to Mass looking as I do. Kevin wakes up from sleeping in the streets or wherever he might be, and he comes to Mass every day. Yesterday, when we went to communion and returned to our seats, every one of us had a Christmas card in our seats that was given to us by Kevin. And in my mind, I heard Jesus say, I came so that you might have life and have it abundantly. Kevin brought me abundant life Just like the woman who only had the 2 coins that she could give in Scripture. Everything he had. He probably could have, I don't know how he got those cards, but if he had money, he chose to buy those cards. And then he chose to give those away to his friends who see Christ in him every day at that Mass. I came so that you might have life and have it abundantly. So what can you do? Kevin did that for me, right? What can every single one of us do in every single moment to help others have life and have it abundantly? To me, that's the cultivation of hope that we can do. Dr. Manta?
Well, I'm not going to follow that. No, I was just, I wanted to follow up on what this fine student asked me about choreography. You know, a lot of times the language that we use when we talk about the pedagogy of hope can sound pretty exalted. More often, particularly at this time of the semester, I kind of feel like I'm the horse stall cleaner outer of hope. There are a lot of papers to grade. There is a lot of grunt work to be done in the trenches, so to speak. And the question that often comes up among faculty is, does this scale? You know, the kind of personal instruction that liberal education really excels at is not an industrial model of education at all. It doesn't scale the way that a large language model is scaled. So my question has to do with, in this new age where we're coming into really powerful technical tools, is there do you see that more as an opportunity or a threat for how liberal education makes a case for itself? Is the case going to be now stronger for liberally educated people, or do you think the prognosis is not good?
I mean, I think this question about scalability is really an important one, which is, I think, part of the reason why we deliberately keep our class sizes in PLS quite small for our seminars, you know, like 12 or 15, like, ooh, that's a little big, you know. So I think that's important because, I mean, fundamentally this idea that heart speaks to heart, you can't do that like according to these kind of larger scale things. I think that, I mean, I'm maybe an eternal optimist, but I think that these ideas that people who actually know how to engage in this kind of granular, person-to-person, heart-to-heart way, that you make yourself irreplaceable. And I think that's actually a good thing for liberal education and liberal educated students, you know, that you're able to like look at text and make judgments, practical judgments, not just kind of like machine judgments. Like you kind of can make a sort of practical case for something. You understand kind of these networks of relationships that I think large language models don't. I mean, what I would say, if anyone's feeling discouraged or tired and not able to kind of like scale the mountains of this kind of exalted notion of hope, I would say over Christmas break, you should get a copy of Charles Pegue's Portal of the Mystery of Hope and read it very slowly, because it gives us this picture of hope as something that is not kind of this exalted thing. It is day by day. It is being disappointed, being tired, feeling like we're doing the same thing all over and over again. But he says at the end, what we don't realize is that when we show up every day and we try our best and we what it's really doing is building a bridge that's leading us to heaven. And I think it's a kind of like way of sacralizing ordinary life. So Portal of the Mystery of Hope, Charles Pegue, will give you a very modest but transformative vision of hope, which I think we can all do well to reflect upon.
And what a way to wrap up the season. What a way to wrap up our season. So as we started off, first off, Dr. Martin, thank you again for your time, for taking the time to prepare such a wonderful presentation. Can we give her a round of applause? And thank you to our students who have given of your time these 7 weeks that we've had together. Many of you, the guests that have come in throughout. And you know, I hope that as we began this season, the very first set of speakers, if you recall, spoke about you trying to identify what your personal mission is in life. And then there were a thread of themes all the way through the rest of the season that talked about service, right? And each of us being able to serve in our own way. You might remember Kevin Schmiegel a couple of weeks ago. He talked about living a life of service. And that is that cultivation of hope as well, right? It's how is it that we can serve one another? How is it that we can be humble servant leaders? And with that, I want to close with something that I often get invited to give talks to leadership groups. And a lot of us are very familiar with scripture that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If you've been to weddings, a lot of Catholic weddings, among the readings that will be read are verses 4 through 13, where it says, love is patient, love is kind, it is not jealous, love is not pompous, it is not inflated, it is not rude, it does not seek its own interests, it is not quick-tempered, it does not brood over injury, it does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Well, that reading, you're here in a leadership class, and I always like to substitute the word leadership for love. Leadership is patient. Leadership is kind. It is not jealous. Leadership is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It bears all things. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Leadership never fails when it's like that. So you all, whether you're going to graduate from here in 3 years or this year, you go into the world as engineers and as doctors and as business people and as entrepreneurs and as husbands and wives and as moms and dads, as members of your community, as citizens on this world, on this earth, and citizens for heaven. I hope that you know that we are called to lead and live differently. And if there's any one message that this class hopefully has given you, these 7 sessions, is that you are called to live and lead differently. We're called to lead and live the Holy Cross way. So may God bless you all. Thank you all for being a part of this, and enjoy the weekend. Go Irish, go Saints, and happy Thanksgiving to everyone. May God bless you.